Our Yom Teruah event was a great time for the believers to get together. We packed out our auditorium here. We had the former Muslim Brotherhood Islamic terrorists with us, also Bill Cloud. And I asked Bill Cloud to be with us for Shabbat Night Live to continue to speak more concerning the age of redemption, the age in which we are now living. And it is at this time that Shaul speaks prophetically concerning the end of the age, and he says about this time in which the brimstone hits the fan, there hath no temptation taken you but that which is common to man. But God is faithful, and he will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able to stand, but will with the temptation make a way to escape, literally in the Greek, ekbano, to take into one's hand, to shelter, protect in one's hand, so that they might be able to endure during this time. And it is the very words of Shaul that speak of this, is that the Almighty has given us an ensample, a visible example of us coming out of Egypt and what it is going to be like in a greater exodus that is planned, in which Israel, which has been scattered throughout all the nations of the world, is brought back into the land. That same nation that was not large enough to dwell in all the land, and so all the land wasn't given at that time, but in the end time, the prophet Isaiah says that we are all going to be coming into the land after a great time of tribulation, a great time of trial, and when we come into the land, we're going to say that it's not enough room, and he says, no, the enemy is driven far off. You've got the land, take it, and then more children come into the land. More of the children of Israel come into the land. We say, we still need more room, and he says, you've got more room, take it, it's yours. We are going to see this time that is coming upon the world. This is the age in which we live, and to take us back into these ensamples, into these living examples that are written for our understanding and learning, upon whom the end of the ages come. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Cloud's back with us.
Oh,
Bill.
Michael, once again, thank you, sir.
Wonderful, wonderful. I have really enjoyed the last few weeks with you, Bill, and as
here.
we've been going through this, and of course, Shaul's example starts right here with crossing over the, being baptized in the Red Sea, but there's a lot that happens before then, before that final miraculous crossover, and we have that picture of in the cloud and with the pillar of fire being led by the Spirit, but it even goes back before that as far as that ensample continue taking us on this journey with you.
I think it's fair to say that we could take Paul's words and translate them this way. Take a look at all of that. You know, what happened before, what happened as they came out, look what happened after they came out. In fact, before...
And even when we got into the land, it's all the way through.
Right. One of the things that I thought that maybe to kind of kick us off here today was in 1 Corinthians 10, some of the things that he goes into that they fell victim to, or that they failed in. Verse 6, he says, these things became our examples to the intent, or for the purpose, that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Messiah as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. So he's going through, look, they did this, they did this, they did this. Let's not repeat those mistakes. So we could read those things and think, you know, I'm not going to tempt Messiah, I'm not going to fall into sexual immorality, etc. But if we keep reading, something very interesting develops. In verse 10, he says, nor complain. And, you know, I have to admit that I'm not exempt from that one. And I'm going to relate it to some of the things that are going on in our country right now. There are things that are going on in our country that I have been complaining about. There's things that I don't like, and here's what it boils down to for me. I find myself in my weaker moments wishing we could go back to the way things used to be, or we could go back to a time that I'm comfortable with. I've kidded through the years that if I had my way, Ronald Reagan would still be the president, and we'd all live in Mayberry, North Carolina. Right? So
those were the days.
Those were the days, and there wouldn't be any such thing as heavy metal or rap, But that's just my little paradise, right? But what I'm really saying is, I wish that we could go back to the way things I want them to be, and not longing for what the Creator wants things to be. I want it to be comfortable for me. I'm not really
just
geared up.
Choose a little less evil instead of the grand.
Right. So
plan.
my will, my desire, my flesh isn't geared up for what I know has to happen in order to bring about what the end result is in this day of redemption.
That's right. And we see in the book of Revelation that Babylon, the entire system, has to come down. It has to be utterly destroyed, and it will never rise again. That's part of it.
Exactly.
And we're living in Babylon. That's a hard word that, we love it to be a figure of speech, but
but no, it's a reality.
Yeah.
And so my will, my desire, doesn't really like that idea. I mean, if I could be comfortable, I would choose to be comfortable over being uncomfortable. So my point is here, he also admonishes us not to complain, because as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. And here's why I find that fascinating. Because it is the destroyer, when he's passing through the land of Egypt in Exodus 12, those who had placed the blood upon the doorposts and the lintels of their home, the Creator says, I will pass over you. And in verse 23, Moses said, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter into your homes. And so we have a scenario where there are those who trusted in the blood of the Lamb to save them from Egypt, but got into a place where they didn't trust the Creator to finish the job. And so they begin to complain, were destroyed by the very destroyer that had once had to pass by their doors when they had the blood upon the door. All right? So the idea here is that if I find myself complaining about all of the things that are going on in the nation, because, and here's the key, because I want things to be a certain way, then I think that we need to be very careful, and we need to really check our motives and how well do we know Him? Do we know about Him and we just want what we want and coexist with these things? Or are we willing to say, your will be done? Whatever that means for nations, for kingdoms, for presidential elections, whatever it means, your will be done. Are we willing to live with that? Now, there's another thing there about that, the concept of the destroyer, that relates to something I wanted to talk about in the pattern that we find in the Exodus. And that is when the pit is opened in Revelation chapter 9, and you have the smoke coming out as the smoke of a furnace, and then you have locusts coming out, something we're going to talk about in just a moment. Then the king of the bottomless pit is released. And his name in Hebrew is Abaddon. In Greek it's Apollyon, but in Hebrew it's Abaddon. Avad means to destroy. And so that's why some translations render Abaddon as destroyer. All right, so when the pit is open, the destroyer is released. But what is the destroyer preceded by in Revelation 9? These entities, whatever the right word is, that are likened unto locusts. And I find that interesting because one of the things that the Creator brought against the land of Egypt as He judged the gods of Egypt in Exodus 10 were locusts. So in Exodus 10, Moses goes to Pharaoh. I'll paraphrase for the sake of time. He says, if you don't let my people go, tomorrow I'm going to bring the locusts into your territory. And when I bring them into your territory, they're going to cover the land. It's going to be unlike anything you've ever seen. So I don't think that there's anything superfluous in Scripture. The words are there for a reason. And if He says He's going to bring locusts into the land, that means that up until that point in time, they weren't. He has to bring them from somewhere into that land. So in Exodus 10, verse 12, this is what it says. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt for the locusts, that they may come upon the land of Egypt, eat every herb of the land, all that the hail has left. So Moses stretched out his rod over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind on the land all that day, all that night. When it was morning, the east wind brought the locusts. And I'll just skip on down, and it just says that, verse 15, when they had finished covering the land, nothing green on the trees or on the plants of the field remained. So here's where I'm going with this. Here we have a government, and the chief executive of that government, who says, I don't know the Lord. I don't know the God of Israel. I don't acknowledge his authority. Today, not just in this nation, but across the world, we have leaders who don't know him, who profess one thing, but their actions say otherwise. And they don't recognize his authority. In fact, they defy his authority. Yeah. They say same-sex marriage is equivalent to what God has established. They say that if you think you're a woman, you can go in the lady, all this bizarre stuff. They don't know him, and they have hardened their hearts. So to Pharaoh, he says, because of that, I'm going to bring locusts into your territory. And it's going to be an east wind that brings them. In Genesis chapter 41, we have a Torah portion called Miketz, which literally means at the end. And it picks up with the story of Joseph when he is in prison, and he has interpreted the dreams of the cupbearer who has gone back to Pharaoh, who has forgotten all about Joseph. And so 2 full years pass. And at the end, Miketz of that 2 full years, Pharaoh had a dream, and I think everybody's familiar with that, but he sees the 7 fat cows coming up out of the Nile, followed by the 7 gaunt cows who swallow the healthy cows up. He wakes up, doesn't know what it means, goes back to sleep, and then he sees 7 heads of grain coming up on one stalk. They're plump, they're fat, but then they're withered away or they fall victim to the 7 withered ears that have been scorched or blighted by an east wind. And so it's the same east wind that we can read about in Exodus 10. It's coming from the same direction. Some people interpret this east wind as being a levanter. It is a wind that comes from the Levant. It comes from east of Egypt. And if you go east of Egypt, where you end up.
Saudi Arabia.
You end up in Saudi Arabia. So this wind seems to be coming from the direction of what we now call Saudi Arabia. And in the case of Joseph in his day, it was used to prophesy of a 7-year period of lack and want so dramatic that people would forget about the days of plenty. That's what precipitated this 7 years of lack. In Moses' day, it brings locusts into the land. It brings them into the territory. And so if the east wind originates in an area that we now call Saudi Arabia, I think that there is at least a possibility that the locust did as well. And so this wind brings the locusts into the land of Egypt, the most powerful nation then on earth, that nation that is holding God's people back. God causes these locusts to cover the land and destroy everything that the hail had left. Now, why is that important to us? Because it paints a picture of some of the things that are going on today as it relates to living in the age of redemption. So I want to go to Judges chapter 6 and relate another story. In Judges 6, it begins by saying in verse 1, then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And anytime we read that, nothing good is going to follow. So they did evil in the sight of the Lord, and so the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel. And because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made for themselves the dens, the caves, the strongholds which are in the mountains, and so they're hiding because of the Midianites. And so it was, whenever Israel had sown, Midianites would come up, also Amalekites, and the people of the east would come up against them. So you've got these 3 bands of people coming against the Israelites because they've done evil in the sight of the Lord, and it tells us who they are: Midianites, Amalekites, descendants of Esau, and the people of the east. Now, where do the Midianites dwell? In the Arabian Peninsula. Where are the Amalekites? Where do they reside? Typically in what we now call the Arabian Peninsula. The people of the east, I don't think that's talking about the Red Chinese or the North Koreans. It's talking about the people who lived east in areas, the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East, perhaps Mesopotamia, that part of the world. And what are they doing? Every time Israel has sown in their fields, before Israel can reap their harvest, these three bands of people are coming in, and it says in verse 4, they would encamp against them, that is against Israel, destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor donkey. They are devouring, consuming, destroying every green thing, everything that would provide sustenance for Israel, just like the locusts did in Exodus 10. And then if we come over to the battle that occurs there when Gideon and his 300 engage these three bands of people, we can read that in chapter 7, just before the battle. Verse 12, it says, the Midianites, the Amalekites, all of the people of the east were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts. I think some translations render it grasshoppers.
Grasshoppers, King James.
But they are as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number as the sand by the seashore in multitude. So of all the things that these people, these invaders that are coming from the east, coming against those that have done evil in the sight of the Lord, of all the things that they could be likened to, the Scripture likens them unto locusts, which, remember, locust-like entities, creatures, are what are released from that pit in Revelation chapter 9 in advance of the king of the bottomless pit, the destroyer, being released. Now, the battle takes place, and the enemies of Israel are destroyed, but there are a couple of their leaders that escape the battle, Zebah and Zalmunna. And so in chapter 8 of Judges, Gideon and a small group of people overtake them. And in verse 20 of chapter 8, Gideon said to Yether, his firstborn, rise and kill them. But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. And so Zebah and Zalmunna said to Gideon, rise yourself and kill us. For as a man is, so is his strength. And so Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna and took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. So here's the picture we're trying to paint for people. They came from the region of Saudi Arabia, perhaps regions in Mesopotamia, and they're coming into the land of Israel to come against God's people. Why are they allowed to do that? Because God's people have done evil in the sight of the Lord. They have turned away from Him, from His instructions. So this is what He allows to happen. Remember, we said in a previous program that if God's people break covenant and turn their face away from Him, He turns His face away from them. He removes His presence. If He removes His presence, another presence comes in and fills the vacuum. And in a sense, that's what's happening. They've done evil in the sight of the Lord. He has delivered them into the hands of the Midianites, the Amalekites, the people of the east, who are likened unto locusts, who behave as locusts do in that they consume everything that is supposed to be sustenance for Israel. And just in case we haven't made the connection yet, when Gideon overtakes and kills these two princes, he removes crescent-shaped ornaments from their camels' necks. So I think anybody who's
moon god worshipers in, still to this very day.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the connection is this, that those people are likened unto locusts. God brings locusts into the land of Egypt because the leader of Egypt has hardened his heart against God's purposes where His people are concerned. There are still those of God's people, presumably, who are more fearful of Pharaoh than they are of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So as He brings judgment upon the land of Egypt, He judges all the gods of Egypt, including Pharaoh. Eventually, he's going to be destroyed in the sea. In Gideon's day, because the people of Israel did evil in the Lord's sight, he allowed these quote-unquote locusts to come in and to devour the land. We see where they're coming from, and hopefully everybody sees the connection to what's going on in our world today with this, well, let's put it this way, ISIS and groups like that. All right, they make their base in the Levant, in the Fertile Crescent, in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, Syria, these places. But where are they reaching? What is the movement? What is the migration of their influence? Which direction is it headed? It doesn't seem to be drifting toward the east. It seems to be coming from the east, and it's blowing west, and it's coming across Europe, and it's beginning, well, has been coming into the United States. And so we've not only got these Islamists attacking innocent people in Brussels and Paris and Germany, but we've got places like Orlando and San Bernardino and probably a host of other places in the United States that haven't even made the news. Yeah, exactly, Fort Hood.
Yeah. The Islamic chaplain, butchering several people there.
I guess it should be clear, but what I'm trying to suggest is one of the reasons we know we're living in the age of redemption is we see the locusts blowing toward the west. We see this invasion coming, and its intent is to cover the entire land and to destroy and to chew and to consume. If I may, I realize that we want to take a break here in just a moment, but something that Joel has to say is relevant to this conversation. And in Joel chapter 1, you know what, if I may, before I do that, there's something in Hosea that needs to be mentioned here. Because we had talked about Hosea in several programs several weeks ago. But in Hosea chapter 5, the Creator, in speaking to His people, the house of Israel, says in verse 4, "They do not direct their deeds toward turning to their God, for the spirit of harlotry is in their midst." This coexisting with these other philosophies, entertaining these other ideologies and mixing them with the truth. We've inherited lies. We've embraced these half-truths, which is nothing more than a lie. We now live in a day and time when not only does the culture get blue bumper stickers that say coexist and put them on the back of a car, but I can pull into a church parking lot and see the same bumper sticker next to a fish symbol. So the spirit of harlotry, he says, is among them, and they do not know the Lord. So he is addressing the fact that they are willing to coexist with all these other ideas and philosophies. And so then in chapter 13 of Hosea, as a consequence of that, to a backslidden people, he says this in verse 15, "Though he is fruitful among his brethren, an east wind shall come. The wind of the Lord shall come up from the wilderness. Then his spring shall become dry, and his fountain shall be dried up." So an east wind factors heavily into what happens in Pharaoh's dream. It brings about a time of 7 years of lack, and that's unprecedented in his day. It's an east wind that brings the locust into the land of Egypt in Exodus 10 because of Pharaoh's hardened heart. And in Hosea, because his people are backslidden, they have the spirit of harlotry among them, an east wind is going to blow. What is it going to bring? If we turn the page, I'm of the opinion that Joel gives the answer. Because in chapter 1, he says this. He says, "Hear, you elders, give ear, all you inhabitants of the land. Has anything like this happened in your days or even in the days of your fathers?" And then he goes on to describe what's about to happen. Verse 4, "What the chewing locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. The swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. What the crawling locust left, the consuming locust has eaten." And so from there, he goes on to say, "Awake, you're drunk, you've passed out, you're asleep. You have no idea what's getting ready to happen." And in chapter 2, he says, "Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm in my holy mountain." Why? Because the day of the Lord is at hand. It is coming, a day of gloominess and darkness, thick clouds and darkness. And a people are coming, great and strong, the like of whom has never been, nor will there ever be any such after them, even for many successive generations. And he goes on and talks about how the land before them is like the Garden of Eden, behind them a desolate wilderness. Now, I realize that the prophecy in Joel is referring specifically to the land of Israel, but I want to just entertain the possibility that the principles and concepts can be applied anywhere where God's people are. If God's people are in this nation, for instance, and we, as we've discussed earlier, have turned our face away from Him, if as a nation we've turned our face away from Him, if we were in covenant with Him, would He allow some of the same consequence to befall us? In fact, would He be so specific as to allow an invasion of locusts, so to speak, that are going to come and to chew, devour, destroy, and consume? I want to pause. I know you want to take a break here, but I just wanted to get some of that in there, and then we can come back to it if you'd like.
Okay, right. I hate to take a break, but if I don't, then the ox is so completely muzzled that the ox then withers and dies before the locusts get here. So this is the opportunity that we stop things for just a moment and invite you to participate in this ministry. For generations, the world in which Bill and I grew up, our ties all went to building big buildings and paving parking lots and padding pews. In this generation, however, we are reaching out to the entire world, around the world, and we do so at great energy, at great expense, with more than 30 employees in a Rood Awakening. It is a very large operation to be able to give away and get this message out to the world free of charge. And so we invite you to participate with us now, because this is your home, this is your kahila, this is your congregation. We may be spread over several continents and may be spread over weeks and months and years from now, but our continued ability to minister to you comes from your obedience to minister back to us. We have freely given. Now it is your opportunity to freely give. So we'll give you just a few moments, and then we'll be back with more from Bill Cloud. Bill Cloud left off with the prophecy of Joel that speaks of the army of invading locusts, the army that's going to come into the land of Israel. Before them, it is like the Garden of Eden. Behind them, it is a smoking, desolate wasteland. And if not for the act of the Almighty who steps in, there is no hope for the salvation of Israel. It would be completely obliterated from the earth. Zechariah speaks of this in the 12th chapter, verses 2 and following. I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege, both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And in that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against this. And from this, Bill, I look at this situation that results in Joel, in that invasion that transpires. It's a smoking, desolate wasteland, and it is that invasion that causes the atmospheric event of the sun being darkened, the moon turning to blood. That's a blood moon. Every incident of blood moon in the Bible is referring to that very incident, which is an atmospheric event. It is not it's not an eclipse. An eclipse is a sign in the heaven, but this is speaking of the atmospheric event that is a result of this horrendous war. And I've always looked at that is that all those who burden themselves with Israel, and the United States is about the only one that stands with Israel at this time. At this time. But even our congressman, just this 2 weeks ago, was telling Netanyahu to tell the President of the United States to do something that I can't repeat on the air, especially on Christian television.
Okay.
But there is those who would want to stand with Israel, support Israel, are now being castigated. It looks like everything that is being done, from the president bowing to Muslim kings and princes around the world, which is literally an act of treason. You know, I worked for the U.S. State Department. I was in the Marine Security Guard Battalion, and we learned the protocols of what you do and what you do not do. And if a private in the Marine Corps had bowed to a Muslim prince or dipped the American flag, they would be in prison for doing what Obama did. This is what we were trained to do. We knew how exactly what the protocols were. We were instructed that the President of the United States will never kiss the Pope's ring. We'll never bow to another dignitary of any other nation, because we stand as sovereign upon the planet. But yet, that is what our president did, bowing to Muslim princes, and everything that he's done has been bowing to the eastern hordes, the Locust, which is now all set up. And, it looked like ISIS came out of nowhere, but they really didn't. Because when the United States, against all of the military advisors of President Obama, said, do not tell them when we're leaving, but yet he announced when we were leaving, and then what did he leave behind? 2,300 fully equipped Hummers, Hum vehicles, 50 caliber machine guns, and they were completely outfitted to do battle and to wipe everything out. He completely outfitted ISIS to do what they are doing right now.
We more or less created them.
Oh, we created them, absolutely.
Yes.
They'd be on a camel. They'd be jumping across the desert on camels, still herding sheep, okay? But no, 2,300. 2,300. You have any idea the value of that? No. And so now recently he said, well, we have to let the other Muslims, take care of them. The ones that they didn't give 2,300 Hummers to.
It would almost make you believe in conspiracies, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No doubt. This is what was planned, but we're seeing that what you have been painting a picture of, and just where they're coming from, this example that we see over and over and over, it is telling us something that we see going on right now, and there is no way that you can deny that. Well, it's more than a coincidence, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely. A few things that popped in my mind while you were talking, and we've said it several times now, is that if the presence of the Creator is removed from a situation, that opens the door for another presence to come in, and it will not have the best interests of God's people in mind. Now, I want to choose these words very carefully. I don't want it to be misconstrued as saying what I'm not. But if there has been a time when the Almighty has been welcome in this nation, and will we'll kind of fine tune it a little bit. He's been welcome in the people's house, the seat of government. But now he has been pushed out, asked to leave, or he's just departed. Mm-hmm. Then another presence has come in, another mindset has come in. In 1 Samuel, chapter 2, I believe it is, when the unnamed prophet goes to Eli the high priest, he says, the end of your days are at hand. I'm going to kill your sons, Hophni and Pinchas, and when I've gotten through with you, you will see an enemy in my dwelling place. Interestingly, the word enemy or foe there is czar. You will see a czar in my dwelling place. All right, but what is he saying? I'm not there, so another presence is going to be there, and you're not going to like what this one has to do. You're not going to like it. So going back to what's going on in our nation, I'm certainly not going to pretend that every president that has been before has been a man of God. I'm not that naive, but I think as a nation, we have, up until a certain point, certainly wanted God to dwell with us. We've wanted Him to abide with us. We've wanted to honor Him, even with all of our warts and flaws. But now things have become blatantly against God, against His Word, against Israel, and in deference to those who want to destroy God's people, those who want to destroy God's people. And so this wave that is emanating from the east, in the Middle East, and Mesopotamia, and Iraq, and Syria, and Saudi Arabia, as it moves west, there are those that almost invite it. They welcome it. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Because it is a reflection of the state of affairs in the hearts of God's people. What goes on in politics, what goes on the national scene is, to some degree, a reflection of what is going on in our hearts. Because if that were not so, He would have said, if those people who don't believe in me, who don't think I exist, if they would humble themselves, seek my face and pray, etc. But He doesn't say that. He says, if my people, if they would humble themselves, seek my face and pray, turn from their wicked ways, then He will hear, then He will forgive, then He will heal their land. So what Joel describes is an army of invaders that, yes, specifically are coming against the land of Israel. I'm just one of those that believe that we can exact from that a concept that if He's going to allow this to happen in the land of Israel, or warn the inhabitants of Israel that this is about to happen, then the warning would be applicable to wherever His people are.
We have seen the repercussions of this Islamic invasion first in Europe, which has really, as far as the church is concerned, has really gone far away from God, and left much earlier than America has.
Yes.
And so now we're seeing that invasion happen there. Now we're seeing the doors wide open for all sorts of evil to continue to breed in America at this point, and there's no stopping it.
So exactly, and it makes me wonder if there is that kind of that level of threat to our lifestyle. What would people be willing to compromise in order to make peace, or to coexist, or to even have a ceasefire? What would they be willing to compromise? What would they be willing to abandon and walk away from? And to some degree, to me, it seems that's already happening. We're embracing, or the country, I should say, is embracing the idea that this Islam is a religion of peace, and at the same time disdain and castigate this book and everything it stands for.
Yeah, Christians are the problem, and Islam is a religion of peace.
Yeah, well, as I understand it, they are a religion of peace when the world has become Islamic. That's when they're a religion
everyone
of
submits.
Peace.
I mean, that's the point. You have to submit, because they're the whole base of the religion, to prove that their God is superior, that He is greater, is that everyone is subservient and has to be under their rule of law, and if not dead, paying tax and submitting to their rule of law. And here we live according to the Constitution, and Sharia law is it's a joke.
Well,
It's a man-made laws from hell.
excuse me. I wasn't going to do this, but I'm just going to throw something out there that I find of interest. And it has to do with ISIS. You know, when they begin to try to validate themselves as a nation, a sovereign entity, they begin to coin mint their own coin and develop their own currency. And so I was looking at a picture of some of the things that they had coined. On the back of one, they had a map of the entire world. And there was no explanation, but I'm making the assumption that they have a map of the entire world because that's their objective. That's their goal.
Universal Caliphate.
Right. Another one had heads of grain on the back of it. And that really caught my eye. On the back of this one coin, it has heads of grain. Looks like wheat. So I thought, I'm going to count them. And I counted them. And interestingly enough, there were 7 heads of grain on the back of that.
I already knew you were going to say that. It's
Really?
like, okay, there it is.
So
wow.
either
That's incredible.
either that's just one big cosmic coincidence.
Good meal for Locust.
Right. And it reminds one of the dream that Pharaoh had, that this is what's happening. This east wind is blowing.
Incredible.
So it's happening. Now, what do we take away from this? Why is this important to me? You know, as a young believer, I remember there's a song we used to sing in church. Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Based, right, what we read
Joel.
here. We used to think, or at least I used to think, that the army that we were celebrating and singing about, this army that they march on the city, they run on the wall, great is the army that carries out his word. I used to think that we were that army.
right.
And then I started reading that actually what we were celebrating was an army of locusts that is coming against us because we are asleep, we are like drunkards, and we need to be awakened from our slumber. And he goes on and even says very plainly in verse 25, he talks about my great army which I've sent amongst you. So when it gets right down to it, what's happening, Michael, is it's not necessarily that this politician's doing it or this party's doing this or this group of people's doing that. What we're seeing going on is a consequence at large of where God's people are in relation to what He's saying to them and what He's wanting to do in the earth. And
Is it not He who is bringing on this judgment because of where God's people are at?
Absolutely. It is.
It's hard to say that, but just as it speaks of Isaiah, being of Cyrus, I create good and evil. I mean, the evil that is, Cyrus just wiping out everyone with his ability to do so, yet that was of the Almighty. He was the one that empowered that, and judgment was brought because the Almighty is in charge of the universe.
Well, in the very first program, several weeks ago, we talked about that He is the one who caused the kingdom to be divided. He said, this is of me. And division is not something we relate to the Creator. You know, we think about Him wanting to put everything back together and make it whole, which He does, which is exactly why at that time He divided, not to keep them divided, but He would bring them back together. And when He brings something back together, it's stronger than it ever has been. It's because it served His purpose to divide, but now it's going to serve His purpose to bring it back and to restore. And so likewise, when we think of things like this, it's hard for us to reconcile why the Creator would allow something like this. Why would this be His army? Well, if He's going to break something down, whether it be an institution, a nation, what have you, it's the destruction is not the goal. It's to break something down to build something up. If He's going to cause a nation or nations to decrease, it's because He's restoring a nation. He's building up Zion. And so if He brings this army against a nation, the nations, it's just another way He has of pointing His people to look. Those things that you've placed your confidence in, those other nations, those other gods, those other things, they're all coming to an end. And so now is the time for you to begin to search for me, seek me with all your heart. And let me read this and then I'll pause. That's why in Joel 2, I believe he says this. He's describing how destructive this army of locusts is. And by the way, he makes it clear in verse 7 that you cannot build a wall expecting to keep these people out. They climb over the wall. Mm-hmm. So just for what it's worth. But then he says this in verse 12. Now therefore, says the Lord, turn to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning. Rend your heart and not your garments, and return to the Lord your God. He is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, of great kindness, and he relents from doing harm. Who knows if he will turn and relent? So it's clear to me that he's saying, yes, this is what's getting ready to happen, or this is what's happening, but here's why, and here's what I'm provoking you to do. Turn back to me with everything you've got within you. Turn away from all these other things, all these idols of Egypt, all the abominations. Turn to me with your whole heart. And if we do that, verse 25, he says this, I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the crawling locust, the consuming locust, the chewing locust, my great army which I sent among you. And he goes on and says, verse 28, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, etc. I will pour out my spirit on you in those days. That's what he desires to do.
In those days, and it's after that invasion. It is after the Almighty turns them into a stench in his nostril. The reek of the rotting carcasses reaches up into heaven.
Well, and we could couple that with what it says in Ezekiel 36, when he is bringing them out of the nations, where they have profaned his name, he says. He's bringing them out of the nations into their own land. That's when he replaces that heart of stone with a heart of flesh. And he says, I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, observe my judgments, and do them. So his spirit is being poured out upon his people because he is restoring the kingdom. He's eliminating all of these other nations and kingdoms and kings and potentates so that his people come to abide in a place where there's only one king and his name is one.
Bill, you and I have, at different points in history, we've ended up down on the Gulf Coast of the United States of America and the home of Jim and Penny Caldwell.
Yes.
And we were discussing this a little bit earlier, and the discovery of these sandaled footprints, which are all over the Arabian Peninsula down there. And as the promise was, every place that the sole of your foot treads, that have I given you as your inheritance. And do we not see the very thing that you're talking about? Everything coming from the east, from what is now Saudi Arabia, the Saudi family, but Arabia. That this is really, it is, according to Jim Caldwell, the ancient area of Midian, the Midian oil fields, are the richest, sweetest crude oil in the world. And they haven't even begun to touch that because they have so much oil, they don't need to touch it. But he says it is so sweet, it is so pure, you can take it right out of the ground and put it in the engine of your car.
Wow.
And according to what the testimony on this, if this is really true, and they have charted this, Miles Jones has been around the Arabian Peninsula, Dr. David Cho has been around and has seen these footprints all over the Arabian Peninsula, and of course we had 42 camping sites during our 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and we only know and can identify one which is not there, which is at Har Kharkoum, and I believe there's another one in Israel as well, where the second split rock is. Okay. But this is the area that has been promised for all the way from the Euphrates to the Great River in Egypt. That belongs to Israel. This is the ancient title deed that the Israelites put their sandaled feet there, and one day we're going to need that land. And it doesn't look like it's going to be that long from now.
Well, that's a very interesting point, something I have pondered for years. Well, let me read something that, in my mind, connects. It says in Hosea chapter 2, remember Hosea, the essence of that is God speaking to his people who have the spirit of harlotry, Gomer, the whole thing there. But in chapter 2, verse 14, he says, behold, I will allure her, speaking of this wayward betrothed of his, Israel, I will allure her, will bring her into the wilderness, speak comfort to her. I will give her her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor is a door of hope. She shall sing there, as in the days of her youth, as in the days when she come up from the land of Egypt. And then he goes on and talks about, in that day, says the Lord, that you will call me my husband. Ishi, you'll no longer call me my master, for I will take from her mouths the names of the Baalim, and they shall be remembered no more by their name no more. But in verse 19, he says this, I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and justice, as loving kindness and mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know, Yada, the Lord. And that word there is to convey the idea of intimacy. Obviously, we're talking in a spiritual way here, but nonetheless, husband. We're not going to have the names of these other Baalims in our mouth. All right, so here's my point. If patterns are consistent and if they are literal, he says there's going to come a day he's going to lure his people into the wilderness. He's going to do what he did when he brought them up from the land of Egypt. And when they left the land of Egypt and they went to Mount Sinai, and Mount Sinai is not over there at the monastery at St. Catherine's, but is actually in the Arabian Peninsula. And if the people of God walked and traversed that land, then it will happen as he said. It will happen literally. So speaking to your point, I believe that Hosea, if not validates that, it at the very least hints that things are going to happen very similarly, if not exactly the way they were before, with this exception, that we will no longer talk about the Lord who lives, who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, but the Lord lives who brought us out from all these other places to which he had scattered us. I guess what I'm trying to say here is I have no doubts in my mind that if that is true, that then the wilderness it's talking about is the same one that he brought them into 3,500 years ago. There's a reason they found those footprints, in other words.
And there's a reason why the Arabian government is trying to bury them and to remove them, because they know the significance of this. They know that these are Yehudi.
Right, right. So, I've never talked about that, publicly, or my thoughts on that publicly, because, that's just one of those things. Well, I don't know. I haven't been there. I haven't seen them myself. I've seen pictures and things like that. And when Jim and Penny and I discussed these things, I was just blown away and fascinated. But it is something I have pondered, And so wouldn't it be ironic that that those that come from that region that are seeking to destroy God's people are being an instrument to provoke God's people to get on the same page with the Creator, to go to a place that all these things are where they're happening right now. It's just something that keeps me up at night.
Well, I am very excited about this. We see so many testimonies that are coming out of the Muslim world in which people are saying that Yeshua appears to them and they become believers. And I mean, tortured believers. I mean, they pay a price for this, but they know what they saw. They know what they heard. They had this revelation of the Messiah. And it's in places where nobody can really get to these people. And it's happening in such a way that it speaks of in the last time the Almighty is going to do something so great that those people will turn to him. They will see that he is the greatest. There is no God but Yehovah. and Yeshua is the prophet.
Right.
And when they see that, it is going to be such a change in world events at that point. So I'm looking forward to that time, because Yeshua is going out of his way, obviously, to make himself known to these people to where no one can get there. But yet, when the Almighty reveals his hand, his power, and he brings his people from all over the world, they're going to see such a profound impact that I think it's going to change the face of the globe.
It just makes you, first of all, be in awe that when we think we've got everything figured out, he's moving pieces over here and he's orchestrating things over there in advance of things we haven't even considered. You know, he really is in control.
Amen.